We're going to first start with the community eligibility provision, the general overview. Okay, so what we're going to talk about in this presentation is the CEP guidance. So the guidance has changed over the years. It's an overview of the program and then kind of a timeline on when things need to be submitted. So our current USDA guidance, we have the Community Eligibility Provision Planning and Implementation Guidance Manual, and this was released in September of 2016. This is where, when most of you call me with a question, I immediately pull out this guidance manual and try to find the answer for that. And then Memo SP 54-2016 is the updated questions and answers, which came September 2016. So a lot of times the questions that you have, they're answered directly in here. And then we have, of course, some information in the eligibility guidance manual. And then we have the actual final rule on community eligibility provision, and then the annual notification and publication requirements, which was released in March. So that's what we just got finished doing. So that when we hounded you for the information, the data, that's for that annual notification publication requirement. And we'll have another requirement that's due in September with the final information. So that's why we try not to stress too much about this original submission as of that April 15th deadline, because it is preliminary, but USDA requires us to get that to them by May 1st. Okay, so it was established by the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act. It does operate on a 4-year cycle. CEP allows students to receive free meals under the NSLP and SPP, and you don't collect or process meal applications. So that's kind of the big, right? Okay. And then there is simplified counting and claiming system. You do not have to do verification. And there, of course, once again, we'll repeat, there's no free and reduced meal applications collected or processed. So anybody who had a review this year, you probably had a finding related to an application or verification or both if you're not operating CEP. Right? Pretty much anybody can probably verify that was one. This definitely saves some of the audit findings when we don't have verification or the applications. So the benefits of CEP, it's equal access to all students, so all meals are served free. You're going to decrease the financial burden on the parents. Hopefully we'll see an increase of participation, less paperwork, more available time to be allocated elsewhere, and then the less audit findings. That's the big one. Okay, so prior to approval for CEP, you must agree to serve all children free breakfast and lunches for 4 successive years. And then paying any costs using non-federal sources associated with breakfast and lunch that is in excess of the federal assistance received. Sometimes this, is where your systems, kind of panic. So they say, what does that mean? It's above what you're getting in reimbursement. So it's not any different than what they're already doing. Most of them are already giving you at least the required match for MFP, if not more. So sometimes this one phrase has that panic of they're going to have to give food service more money when that's not really what this is saying. So just, that tends to be where a lot of them get hung up on, is this having to pay any additional cost. And then, you cannot process meal applications. And sometimes this is where there's some concern regarding other programs, Title I, how's this going to affect these E-rate? All that's separate. And that's what has been really hard, to understand. So for many, many, many years, free and reduced meal applications have been the source of identifying all of these other areas. Whereas now, because CEP was available to the first district in the state when it first came around, they had to relook at how they're going to identify, where this money needs to go for these other programs. So they've had to separate feeding children from funding children. And that for a lot of your systems, they're probably still having a hard time with that. But there is a significant difference between feeding children and funding children. Funding children, somehow uses that other report that SIS is getting. There's some algorithm. I have no idea how that's figured out, but I do know that whether you collect meal applications or income requirements or something, if you're operating CEP, they're not going to use it. So it has nothing to do with your meal applications anymore. Okay, so to participate, you're going to count your total breakfasts and lunches served to students. You cannot be a residential child care institution. And then the SFA by individual site or clusters of sites must have an enrollment with at least 40% of the students considered identified students to participate in CEP. And most of you are kind of used to that now. So we've taught, the worksheet has over time kind of evolved to be able to identify that information for you, so you're able to see it. And you can't even elect to participate in CEP unless you have either created a cluster that is above 40% or individual schools that are at 40% or higher. CEP eligibility, it can be implemented at selected sites or system-wide. Now this is where a lot of you struggle as well with your system. So you look at the system and have pockets that would qualify, or different schools or makeup of schools. A lot of times it's the elementary schools that you can get to qualify, or certain areas of the parish that you can get to qualify, and sometimes it's hard to get the district on board for a partial system. And so, when we get to a little bit later, some of you that have had success with that, can kind of maybe give how you made that work, or how you convinced some of the board members that, it's worth giving the ones that you can give free meals, even though you can't give it to all of them. And then the eligibility is based on the percentage of identified students. Okay, so what are identified students? And this comes up, all the time. What do we count? What do we not count? So DC students and their siblings. So that is that SNAP list that you're receiving. The last one you received was mid-April, but it was as of March 31st. So you can use that run. But yes, you did not receive it until mid-April. And then also any students that are identified as FITAP by means other than an application. I really doubt you're seeing a whole lot of that, right? If any. And then students identified as homeless, runaway, migrant, foster, or Head Start or Even Start by means other than an application. Okay, so if you have a foster child where all you have is a paper application from the household where someone has checked foster, that is not an identified student. So I had a parish call the other day that they had great luck getting a list of students from DCFS of the foster kids in their area, and I was so impressed because I very seldom hear of of having success getting those lists. And she said it took a lot of hounding, but it did work. So if you're needing to get those numbers and you're having some trouble, we can direct you to some people who've had success. It tends to work out a little bit better in the smaller parishes. So the big parishes, they really, I guess the relationships probably aren't as strong in the bigger parishes, so it becomes a little bit harder to get that information. But we're working on it. And we're going to hold all questions until the end of each presentation, just so we don't have to have those on the record. Okay, so how to identify the percent of identified students. So step 1, determine the number of identified students and the student enrollment at each of the prospective sites. So that's what you just did. You're going to divide the number of identified students by the total enrollment, keeping that to 4 decimal places. And then you're going to multiply that value obtained in the previous step by 100 to get the actual percentage. This is done on the worksheet. So most of you probably are not calculating this anymore. You probably were. But now hopefully we've taken some of that away from you to where you let the system kind of figure that out for you, save you some time. So now the system is going to calculate that for you. Okay, so this is another example of what constitutes an identified student. So we have the first is our DC students with required matches. And so this is the name +1. So you're used to seeing that I know the 3Y match, that's what we used to call it, and now you're getting the probability match. What that is, it's already kind of gone through, the system of, it pretty much is a name plus one. So if you identify that as your student, then you accept that information. Now I know sometimes you run into the situation where you've accepted that and then somebody calls and says, hey, that's not my child. All you have to do is go back in your system, put the other status back and just record that information in there. Parent called, an error on the DC list. So we're trying to make it to where you're able to identify more students, which is hopefully helping you. USDA was really, really impressed with, with the new system, with the algorithm. So it seems to be working. So it's just taking some getting used to. Then also we're going to count the DC associated students. So these are the siblings. So when we're extending the benefits out to those siblings that are on the DC list, we're counting those children as well. And then students deemed homeless, migrant, or runaway by the appropriate officials. So you have some kind of list, you have some application, whatever it is that you're in your parish, how you're keeping track of that information. You should have that available. And then students deemed foster by submission of official documentation. So if you can get a list, if you can get the placement papers, whatever it is that you can get from someone other than from the household on that application. And then the others down here, even though some of these students are still free, they're not identified students. So they've submitted an application and they have a SNAP number written on there. If you didn't match them on your DC list, then that is not considered an identified student. So what I would do is I would go back and I would say, oh, look, there's a SNAP number on here. Go back and kind of look through that list, maybe even manually to say, okay, well, maybe there's a match. Because they're telling you that they're receiving SNAP. So kind of go back through that list and see if you can identify them if you haven't already. And then you have your students that are identified free by income on an application, and then of course are reduced and are paid. So the only ones we're counting are those top four. Okay. So here you'll see that what we've done is we've gone through and determined the identified students. We've got 519 out of the total enrollment at this particular site of 754. So that's going to give us an identified student percentage of 68.83. Like I said, other than putting in the basic information, the calculations are being done for you. But we want to make sure that the numbers that we're entering are actually what's going to really be your identified students. Okay. So here you'll see that what we've done is we've gone through and determined the identified students. We've got 519 out of the total enrollment at this particular site of 754. So that's going to give us an identified student percentage of 68.83. Like I said, other than putting in the basic information, the calculations are being done for you. But we want to make sure that the numbers that we're entering are actually what's going to really be your identified students. Okay, so how do we increase our identified students? We're going to target the students eligible for DC, both the students appearing on the DC list and their siblings. You need to utilize all your DC reports for school year 16-17 to maximize the number, and then remember to use all of them. So if anybody's in here from like a private school, a lot of them are not getting all of their matches. So I think if you're looking and seeing a lot of the publics, and so you're probably using all of them, but we're seeing that a lot of the private schools are not utilizing all of the matches as they should. And so we're hoping to even expand on the DC process for next year and make it even more available. So hopefully that's going to come in June. So we're planning on hopefully rolling out that, for the last run, for the June run for this year. They're in testing phase right now. So as soon as that comes out, we'll be able to update as to how that's going to work. But I remember, if any of you remember way back when John mentioned possibly like more of like a live, being able to match even individual students. That's where we're heading, and we're really, really close. So hopefully that'll help, especially when you get students that are enrolling mid-month, in between two runs, you may be able to identify them much sooner. So hopefully we'll see that you'll even match more students in quicker. Okay, so when you have a site that the identified student is too low, so most of you probably have some school in your parish, in your district, that the makeup's a little different than some of the others. So it's a magnet program, it's a charter school, it's something that's a little bit different. And so a lot of times they may not qualify, but being able to combine them with others may get you to where you still are eligible for CEP. So in this example, we have our percent of identified students. It's 38.24, so we have 325 identified students, which is with an enrollment of 850. And then our second site, we have 410 students with an enrollment of 600. So you'll see one of them is less than 40, the other one's greater than 40. Once we add those two together, we'll be able to get a percentage that is over 40 for the two combined. And when you're adding them, you have to go back and start adding the numbers and then do the division again. So you don't add up just the percentages and divide by the number of schools. So you have to go back to actually the numbers and do the division again. Okay, so the CEP multiplier. So this is always a question. What if it changes? So it can be adjusted by USDA. It can range anywhere from 1.3 to 1.6. 1.6 is what's included in the regs. So any change, you will know about it. So it shouldn't sneak up on you. It's just like any other proposed change. It goes through, communication as a proposed rule in the Federal Register. So you're going to know if they decide they want to change it. But right now it's 1.6, and we don't know any differently. And then once the cycle begins, you can lock into the multiplier for 4 years at those sites that are participating in CEP. So as long as the cluster stays the same, then you can lock in for 4 years. So then establishing your claiming percentages, you'll determine the percent of identified students on or before April 1st in the year prior to participation, keeping that to 2 decimal places. Multiply the percent of identified students by the multiplier, which is currently 1.6, to get the free claiming percentage, and then you'll subtract that value obtained in step 2 from 100 to get the percent of a student meals to be claimed at the paid status. So, of course, we know the goal is to have 62.5% identified students to have all your meals claimed at the free status, but that's not always possible. And there are plenty of systems that are probably in this room that could tell you that they've got claiming percentages less than 100%, and they're doing just fine. There's definitely the 62.5 is kind of where everybody tries to get to, but you can be very successful in CEP, not 100% free claiming. Okay, so the rounding rules for calculation, it's carried to 2 decimal places. So the free and paid claiming percentages must be rounded to 2 decimal places to calculate the claim. We manually, Jen particularly, manually checks all of the CEP claims that come in. That was my job before she was hired. But I passed it on. So we manually check all of the claims. So we still, at this point of the school year, are having some systems that the claims are not being calculated correctly. So the rounding may be slightly off. So we're still, even when we're talking about being in May, so we're looking at April claims that are still not completely correct. So, we're working hard to try to get that to where it's more of a streamlined process. That was one of USDA's recommendations, so that we somehow get it kind of built into the system. And I can tell you that both Jen and I would really, really, really like to have it be in the system and not manually check all these claims. Because if you can only imagine, every year the number of systems that are on CEP multiplies. So when I first started, we may have looked at, 40 systems monthly on their claims, and now we're up to over 100. So, and next year, I know there's people in this room that are considering or coming on CEP that's going to cause this number to increase even more. So we definitely need to get it to where it's not as much of a manual process. But, some of you that are participating in CEP are probably wondering, why are we going over claims again? because it's May and they're still wrong. So, all right, so CEP claiming for year 1 and beyond. So, of course, year 1, our claiming is based on the percent of identified students established by April 1 in the year prior to participation. And then years 2 through 4, option 1 is to continue using that claiming percentage in year 1, or you can reestablish with a new claiming percentage. And then if you reestablish, then your 4 years start again. If anybody has heard me talk about this before, I always encourage you to reestablish if your numbers are the same or better. Because I don't know about you, but I don't have a crystal ball. So I don't know when this is going to change. And if my numbers are good, I'd rather lock in for another 4 years than end up at the end of that 4-year cycle going, now what am I going to do? So if your numbers are good, why not reestablish? So it's just kind of, if the numbers are the same or better. Now, of course, if the numbers drop even a tiny bit, I definitely would not reestablish. And I would keep that higher percentage, and, hopefully the next year is much better and you can work through those lists. But I do encourage you to reestablish whenever possible, just so you don't end up in a situation where you're in year 4 and may not be able to get to where you're still qualifying. Okay, so cite ABC example, year 1 of CEP was participation in school year 16-17. In April 2016, cite ABC calculated percentage of identified students was 54.40. So what's the site's free and paid claiming percentage that they used in 16-17? So we're going to do a little bit of math. So our percent of identified students is 54.40. Our current CEP multiplier is 1.6. So when we multiply that percentage by 1.6, that means they'll be claiming 87.04% free and then 12.96% paid. And that 2 decimal places is very important. So it may seem minor, but it can change, the claiming by 1 or 2 meals, which is small on on an individual system basis. But when USDA looks for accuracy, even those 2 little meals definitely is something that is of concern. So we get y'all to fix it. And sometimes we see that you're cutting yourself short by 1 free meal. And I know that it's not a lot of money, but when your budgets are already pretty tight, any bit helps. So we definitely want to make sure that we're getting it accurate and using that 2 decimal places. Okay, so then year 1 claiming percentage. So we're using that 87.04% free. So our breakfast, we've got $26.90, and lunch we have $4,200. So our free breakfast, we're going to take that $26.90 by our percentage, which was the 87.04%. So we're going to claim 2,341 of our total breakfast at the free rate. And we're going to take that total, subtract what we're going to have. Oh, look, I didn't change the numbers. So it's 2,341, and then it's going to give us 349. I had to change this. So if y'all remember back, some of you that have been on CEP for a while, it used to be to 1 decimal place. And so this past year, that was kind of a big change. I know we had to kind of readjust the system because USDA changed it to be 2 decimal places instead of 1. So kind of it's taken a little bit to kind of get used to that. So I pulled some information from an old PowerPoint and changed all the numbers but 1. So, and then the same thing for the free lunches. So we've got the 4,200 by the percentage, the 87.04 gives us the 36.56. And then we're going to subtract the 36.56, which is not right up there, and it's going to give us 544. So the answers are right. Okay, so then we have a change. So site ABC recalculates the percent of identified students and finds an increase. So now your new percentage of identified students is 56.50. So then they decide, okay, it's probably worth it. Let's reestablish. So we've got that 56.50 times the 1.6 gives us 90.40% of our total meals claimed as free. So if this was me, I would have reestablished. Why not, right? Your numbers are slightly better. And sometimes the question comes, well, I'm already 100% free claiming. I'm already 62.5. Once again, if you've got a crystal ball and you can tell that this is not going to change over the next 4 years, go ahead. But you're already required to at least have 1 DC run per year. If you're already looking at those numbers as of April 1 because you have to. If the numbers are good, why not reestablish? You have to have the data anyway. So it's not like you're doing another step by checking it out. USDA is requiring you to have at least one run, and we're having you report that data to us anyway. So it definitely is worth considering, even if you weren't originally thinking about it. If you've already got to do the work and you've got the numbers, why not go ahead? Okay, so then this is just the same calculation. Jen's going to explain the claim in more detail, so she'll be able to show you these examples again. Okay, so then this is just the same calculation. Jen's going to explain the claim in more detail, so she'll be able to show you these examples again. Okay, so the other CEP considerations, so the percent of identified students and the student participation both directly influence reimbursement received. So what that means, so a lot of times the concern is that the numbers are there, but yet you're not really seeing an increase in participation. So a lot of times what that goes back to is, let's talk about the menu. So if we can't get the kids to come in the door, we don't get paid for feeding them. So we may have to go back to the drawing board for our menu and say, okay, how do I increase the participation? Sometimes that's breakfast in the classroom. Sometimes that's, a separate line for lunch, but something to get these kids in the door, because you're not going to get paid for them if they're not eating. And so you would love to see an increase. I kind of like to stay conservative, but some people see some really large increases in participation. And if we don't, that's really where I want to kind of go back to the drawing board and say, let's look at the menu. What are we doing? Why are they not coming in to eat? So the maximum reimbursement is essential when no longer collecting income from students. So that's the one thing, a lot of times when people will call me and say, well, I think I can do CEP when I look at my numbers, and they'll look at reimbursement compared to reimbursement. So they'll look at what they'll get on CEP compared to what they got in reimbursement last year. Well, there's a piece of that puzzle that's being left out, because when you go to CEP, you lose all your student payments for meals. So you've got to take that count into your equation as well, because you've got your student meals and your reimbursement, and then you're only going to have reimbursement. Now the other thing is the extra sales. Those continue. So, and I always encourage you, to let yourself, use that money to supplement your income with extra sales, but that's a constant. So hopefully even, you may even see an increase in your extra sales because they're not having to pay for meals. So you may see that actually increases, which is great, but I try not to take that a whole lot into consideration, because what I want to look is kind of apples to apples. So, let's look at the meals, and then the extra sales should stay consistent, but probably will increase because parents aren't paying for the lunch. So they're going to send more money for, an extra juice. And then it's important to have trained staff who can find the maximum number of identified students by site, and who also work to encourage meal participation. So I don't see anybody from Livingston in here, but Livingston is one of the parishes that went CEP after the flood. And she was a little concerned because she was kind of right at that border where you're probably going to make money, but you're going to have to do a little bit of work. And so they went and did breakfast in the classroom and really focused on breakfast, and were able to increase their participation. And now at this point in the year, she's looking back going, we're in a great place, but a lot of it has to do with that participation, getting it up and being able to really make some money. And I always encourage any system that's electing CEP, focus on breakfast. So the reimbursement for breakfast, it's a little bit easier to make a breakfast under that reimbursement. It's a little bit harder when you start talking about lunch. So if you can focus on breakfast in the classroom, or, other options for breakfast to where you can kind of make a little bit of money off of breakfast, that's still money that you can use for the budget as a whole. So that's can help you in the long run. So, if you ever need help with kind of looking at the menu or helping, we can do that as well. Okay, so other CEP considerations. So with increased participation can possibly come an increase with problems with space capacity issues at serving times. I have not seen this happen, but just something to think about. Also, food storage issues. So I have seen that some of this is a concern, and especially when it start getting with breakfast in classrooms, sometimes it's a little bit harder because you need more storage space. So sometimes that can be a concern, and then possibly increased staffing needs. Most of the time we see that it kind of, you can level out, keep exactly the same thing that you're already doing. But these are things to just go ahead and consider just so you can kind of have all the factors on the table. At least a match once annually, and that's to be able to take advantage of any ISP increases and then observe demographic trends. And what they mean by that is you can kind of get an idea of, hey, the area is changing, our numbers are slowly decreasing, let's come up with a game plan before we get to year 4. So they're wanting you to kind of look at your numbers ahead of time. So and this is why I say if you're already having to do it, you're already figuring out, why wouldn't you reestablish even if you're still at the 62.5%? And if you're only having to run one, use the last one of the year because it's cumulative. So the one you just, the April run that you just got, that's cumulative for the entire school year. So use that one, then you're going to pick up everybody from all the other runs. Okay, so the identified student percentage must be established based on data as of April 1 in the school year prior to CEP election. For this school year, we know April 1 fell on a Saturday, so it was April 3rd this year. Okay, so the identified student percentage must be established based on data as of April 1 in the school year prior to CEP election. For this school year, we know April 1 fell on a Saturday, so it was April 3rd this year. Okay, so the deadline for CEP election is June 30th for systems that are planning to elect CEP beginning in school year 17-18, which is July 1. At this time, there will be no flexibility for that start date. So up to this point, we have the first year they gave a flexibility it was June 30th to August 31st for CEP election. And then it's been, after that date, if you call the state office, we can approve you, which we have, to start at any point in the school year. And then this past school year, we had the flood, which affected about 22 of our parishes. So a lot of them were able to elect CEP after that. And then they were coming at different points in the school year. We've been told by USDA to not expect that for this next school year. So they say they are sticking to this June 30th date. So, which if you're planning it for the school year that starts on July 1, I would encourage you to go ahead and lock it in before that school year starts, because collecting applications, processing applications, changing to CEP, now you're kind of doing twice as much work. So if we know going into the year that we want to go ahead and do CEP, we want to elect it before. But just so you know, the August 31st date, or at the discretion of the state agency, is supposedly not going to be in effect for school year 17-18. So June 30th is the date that we're sticking to at this time. And then applying for CEP is an SFA level decision, but oftentimes, y'all can call us. We've, gone over some PowerPoints of what you're presenting. We've looked at your numbers. Sometimes we can identify things that you may have missed in your numbers, because the last thing we want you to do is to go there and give, misinformation to your board, and then, you're, kind of setting yourself up to be in the firing squad the next year. So we don't want that to happen. So we do try to make sure that the numbers you're using are accurate. So we will help if you need us to look over some of that before you go to a board meeting. And the other question is, do you have to have board approval? That's a local decision. So, some systems, yes, they require board approval. I've seen some where they require just a presentation to the board, but they don't actually vote on it. And then I've seen that they don't tell anybody but the superintendent. So whatever your policy is in your system, it's your policy. So however y'all would handle any other decision like this, but we don't require board approval. Okay, so when will you establish a new CEP year 1? So anytime there's a change in student population that impacts the identified students or the enrollment, the school or group of schools participating in CEP must recalculate the ISP. It's a lot of words. So basically, it becomes a little bit difficult to identify students when you have kind of a partial CEP system. So we have a system that had about 50 of her schools that are CEP, and she's got another 10 that are not. And this year, what's happening is they are closing a few schools, and they're merging another one, and they're taking a high school that was not CEP and making it an elementary school. Okay, all her elementary schools were CEP. Well, now we've got this strange mix of students, and you can't identify who's coming from where, so we're having to reestablish because these are some major changes. A system that is completely CEP across the board and has a new school that they're going to pull 5th graders from one of their other schools and move them to, if they're system-wide, the demographics are not changing, so we don't have to reestablish. So it just depends on your scenario. So, when it's a partial system, if you can identify where those students go, we can try to help you with that. But this particular example, I was at a loss. I mean, when you take a non-CEP high school and then you change it to an elementary school and you've got kids coming from all over, it was very, very difficult. So, unfortunately, the only option is to reestablish in this example. So, of course, normal movement between one year to the next, we expect that. So we're not talking about normal movement between school years. You do not have to reestablish, just on, slight fluctuations in, enrollment. So we're not looking at that. But when you start adding grades, deleting grades, if it's staying in kind of that same cluster or same system, then we can work with that. Once you start pulling in kids from other non-CEP and CEP schools, it becomes much more difficult to identify. So more often than not, that's when we require a reestablishment. Does that make sense? Okay, so can new schools elect CEP? So the answer is yes, they can. If the number of identified students and the total enrollment is available before the counting claiming of meals begins. Okay, so if you have a new school and they're not on NSLP, and they come on and they have this information before they start claiming, the answer is yes. If they cannot get that information, and so sometimes we find that it is extremely difficult to get this information, then unfortunately the answer is no. But it just depends on if you're able to get that information or not. Opting out of CEP, this does not happen. So I have one system that opted out of CEP, and the reason why is because this was back in the beginning, the percentage that they thought they had was not what they really had. So when we went out there to check, and she planned on claiming all the meals free because she thought she had 100% free claiming, she really had like 42% identified students, and so she was claiming a much lower percentage. So she said, well, this isn't financially feasible. And she was right. So I would have probably never opted in. So as long as your information is correct and you're going in knowing the true numbers, then I don't see any reason why you would opt out. But I've had one that opted out, and it was an error in how she understood the numbers to be able to qualify. So, but if you choose to stop CEP, you have to notify us of your decision, notify the households of your decision, and allow ample time for the submission of the free and reduced meal applications so you can get them in, you can process them. And then SFAs must offer all reimbursable free meals for a period of at least 30 operating days following the date of restoration of standard procedures or until a new eligibility determination is made. So basically, you have to give the households time to submit their application to you, to be able to process that application, so you have to give them at least 30 days to get used to the new system. Okay, so end of the CEP cycle, requesting an extension. I'm only going to briefly go over this section because, like I said, I strongly encourage you to reestablish. So at this point, we don't have anybody going into this requesting an extension. So we've worked really hard to kind of, not end up in this situation, if someone panicking about what to do at this point. But you can request an extension if the identified student percentage determined in year 4 on or before April 1st remains greater than 40%. So basically that means you basically are going to reestablish. If an extension is granted, you can use the percent of identified students in year 4 of the prior year cycle to determine your new claiming percentage. So this is kind of what we do on a regular basis. So they're calling it an extension, but it's really basically a reestablishment. So then in turn it's an extension. In year 2, you can either use the identified percentage in year 4 or to use the identified student percentage established in year 1 of the extension if it's higher than what was established in year 4. So we've kind of already gone over that. Now the other option, which this is what we're really trying to avoid, if the SFA does not have an identified student percentage of greater than 40% in year 4, then the SFA may be eligible to remain on the option for an additional year, which is considered a grace period. To be eligible for the grace period, the percent of identified students in year 4 must be between 30 and 39.99. So you're kind of right there on the edge, but technically not qualifying. The SFA can demonstrate an identified student percentage greater than 40% by April 1st of the grace year, then you can get another 4-year cycle. If unable to demonstrate an identified student percentage of at least 40%, the SFA must return to traditional accounting and claiming. Like I said, we try really hard to not get to this point, and we're nowhere close with any of our systems to being in that 4th year cycle because we've worked so hard to convince you just to go ahead and reestablish. Okay, so if the SFA does not have an identified student percentage of at least 30% in year 4, the SFA will not be eligible for a grace year. So then you're not eligible for the grace year, you have to go back to counting and claiming. So I don't want to see any of you here. So that's why we work really hard every year to look at these numbers and come up with, kind of a game plan, because this is going to cause panic, right? So we don't let this catch you blindsided. You've got 4 years that we're going to be talking about this, so we can come up with a plan if you start seeing that your numbers are trending that way. That's why you want to run it on an annual basis. So you can kind of say, hey, look, things are starting to look in a different direction. Let me talk to my board now. Let's start coming up with a plan so that there is something instead of, oh, look, now we're no longer CEP. So we don't want to happen. So, that's why there's all these steps that have come since CEP started with making you look at the lists on an annual basis. We've been talking about reestablishing so that we don't end up here. Okay, carryover eligibility. So this is a big thing. So some of you in the room that have called before and said, what do I do if I have a child transferring from a CEP school to a non-CEP school? And our answer to you was that student does not have a status and you need to get an application on them as soon as possible because the school is CEP, the child is not. You don't have a status on them. Some of you remember that, being told that? Okay. Well, in school year 16-17, USDA changed that. So in school year 16-17, the first 30 operating days or until a new eligibility can be determined when transitioning from a CEP school to a non-CEP school between school years or transferring from a CEP school to a non-CEP school. So even if it's in the year, now you have a 30-year grace period. 30 days, yeah. Yeah, we know 30 years would not be good, right? They're all free forever. But if they're in school for 30 years, we got a problem, right? So first 30-day operating days. So this is a big deal for a lot of you. So a lot of you were trying to really quickly process those applications for these students that were transferring between sites, especially in systems that were partial. And so your elementary, middle schools were CEP, and then they were moving to a high school that was not CEP. And so it was like, how quickly do I have to get these applications in? This is the same process you're used to. at the beginning of a school year anyway. You're used to the 30-day carryover eligibility. So now these students that are at CEP schools match the rest of the carryover eligibility for all other students. Okay. Procedures to ensure ISP accuracy. So part of the CEP election process, state agencies are responsible for ensuring that LEAs seek to adopt CEP, that you meet all the requirements. And so the way we handle this is because eScholar does the match for you. We're able to get a pretty good idea of what your numbers are going to look like. Yes, there are other factors that we don't see, like your homeless migrant, but we all know that those numbers are really small compared to your DC numbers. So, we can get an idea of where you should be. And if your numbers submitted are nowhere close to where you should be, you will get a call from us. But, for the most part, the numbers, we're able to get an idea as to where you're falling. And then memo SFS 16-85, we review 10% or a statistically valid sample of your CEP data to ensure accuracy at the time of your review. So whether we choose 10% or a statistically valid sample really depends on your size of your district. So typically 10% is always the smaller number until you start getting to systems like East Baton Rouge or Caddo, and then we go with the statistically valid sample because it stops at 590. So if 590 is the smaller number, we're going to go with the sample. But if not, then we'll do 10%. Okay, so now we get to some questions that I get all the time. What about the paid lunch equity tool? Do I have to do the paid lunch equity tool? So what do you think the answer is?
Yes.
Yes? You have to do the paid lunch equity tool? So the answer is no. So you don't have to do the paid lunch equity tool. And the reason why is because the whole reason that you have this paid lunch equity tool is so that you can make sure that sufficient funds are provided to the account for the meals that are being paid for. Well, and if you don't have any meals that the households are paying for, then you don't have to do the paid lunch equity tool. And if any of you have tried to do the paid lunch equity tool, I mean, it really is quite confusing. I feel like you jump from one to the other and you start at the bottom of the page and move to the top. And so, I'm not sure exactly, what you need to be able to completely understand it, but I have to read the PowerPoint while I'm looking at it. So if you don't have to do that, that's a lot of time saved because I'm sure you spend a lot of time trying to make sure that you're doing it correctly. Now, if you do have some schools that are CEP and some schools that are not, then yes, you still have to do the paid lunch equity tool because you do have some schools that will be receiving, you'll have the normal counting and claiming, and you will have some paid meals where students are paying. So this is another one that we just got. So y'all all probably have heard of the meal charge policy that you have to have in effect by July 1, right? So if all of your schools are operating a non-pricing provision, so that's CEP, there's also Provision 1, Provision 2, but in Louisiana right now we only have CEP. The SFA is not required to develop a meal charge policy because no children are being charged for meals. But if you have a partial system, then yes, you have to have a meal charge policy. This is number 13 on this memo. You want the answer? I have it memorized. I can't tell you how many times I've answered this question. Because once that memo came out requiring that meal charge policy, that was a lot of questions. What about us? What about us that are operating CEP? So no meal charge policy. Now, if you want to have a meal charge policy, just in case you get off of CEP, more power to you. But you don't have to. Okay, record keeping requirements. You must retain your records used in the development of the ISP during the entire period CEP is in effect. So you must keep them from the initial approval year, and for all years any updates are made. And then you have to keep it for 3 years after the submission of the final claim for reimbursement. So what I always say is this seems like forever. So you're pretty much keeping these records forever. you know, we during our ME last week, we had to pull memos back from like the early 90s, and you know, it's all kinds of crazy things they were looking at. So you know, it doesn't hurt to have it. You know, if you know, if it's just keeping this kind of documentation, it shouldn't be too much information to keep. But it is 3 years after the year of the final claim. So if you're using the data year 1, you've got that cycle for 4 years, that last claim submitted, and then you're going to keep it for another 3 years after that. That's a long time. It's like 7 years. Okay, so that's where we're going to stop with the overview portion. And then I'm going to, y'all have any questions kind of about this section?